So if EV plus electricity is Jolteon, EV plus ice is Glaceon, EV plus grass is Leafeon, what do I give EV to get a Patreon? What's up, everybody, and welcome back to Sounds Good Makes Sense, a discussion show for the World of Warcraft player. My name is Devilor, and today we're going to talk about what's going on in the gaming industry. It seems like every week lately, there's even more layoffs. So we're going to talk about what does that mean for the gaming industry? What does that mean for the people who make games? And by extension, what does that mean for the people who play them? Now, I promise I'll be back to WoW specific content next week. This is just one of those topics that it involves the industry as a whole, so it still has relevance to people who play WoW, regardless of whether it's directly talking about WoW or not. So a couple days ago, I announced a Patreon, which, by the way, the link's down there. Check it out. Please do. Shameless plug. Heck yeah. Moving on. In that video, I talked about how there's just been so many layoffs over the last year and continuing into 2024. Just to go over the numbers again, there were over 10,000 layoffs in the gaming industry in 2023. And that's continuing in already here in January 2024. There's been another 2,700 or more layoffs just in the first half of January. And what makes it even worse is industry experts are saying that if you got laid off from the gaming industry recently, there's still only a 1 in 4 chance that you'll be rehired back into the industry this year. And when I've talked about this before, both in that Patreon video, but also just generally elsewhere, people have always been asking, how did we get here? What got us to this point? Why do you think this is happening? Like, we keep hearing about how all of these companies are making record profits. So why are there so many layoffs? You know, we keep hearing phrases like, oh yeah, 2023 was a great year for games, but a horrible year for game developers. Why is this happening? And while it's true that layoffs have always been pretty common in the gaming industry and in the tech industry, it's never been at quite this scale. It's usually been like, you know, maybe a couple thousand, not 10,000 in a year and almost $3,000 in a single month. So what's going on? Is this just a post-COVID crash? Is this just pure corporate greed? Is there some sort of like systemic problem with the way the industry works? Is there some other crisis going on? What's happening? And the answer, frustratingly, is kind of all of that. It's complicated. So just to get a little groundwork out of the way on how the gaming and tech industry work before we jump into this topic. And I'm going to say gaming and tech a lot throughout this video because even though there are differences in the industries, it's a lot of the same people behind the scenes, and a lot of the way they function is very, very similar. So what's happening in gaming is also happening in tech and vice versa. And both of these industries basically run off of investments. If you're a privately owned company that wants to spin up a new project, you need to get the money to pay the people to complete that project from investment firms. And if you're a publicly traded company, you're getting that same sort of money from shareholders, which are usually investment firms. And in both of those cases, the arrangement with those firms is more or less, give us some money, we'll do things and turn that into more money. And I should note, this is the case for most industries as well. Gaming and tech just move very fast, so we see it a lot more often. Now, when these investors do make these profits off of things, they have a tendency to then immediately reinvest. And that's not just because like that's literally their business model is take money, give it to someone, collect more money afterwards. But it's also like for tax reasons. It makes more sense for them to not have a whole bunch of money just sitting around. Instead, they need to invest that into something else so that they get less taxes and so on and so forth. But this is why when we're having sort of conversations around this sort of thing, we're typically using phrases like net worth. For example, Tencent Holdings, their current net worth as of January 16th was $338 billion. Now, that doesn't mean that they have $338 billion just sitting in a bank account somewhere. What it means is if you were to total up everything that they own, which includes some bank accounts, but it's mostly like companies and shares and so on that they own. If you were to total up the value of all of that, it would reach $338 billion. So the investor's role in all of this is to find things to invest in so that then they can make profits, so then they have more to work with, so that then they can continue to invest and just keep expanding their reach. Which means it comes down to company leadership. So like the CEOs, the presidents, the executives, et cetera, et cetera. It comes down to the leader of gaming and tech companies to find and secure those investors. They need to, first off, find the investors in the first place so they can get money to get started. But once they're established, they need to keep those investors happy so that when those investors make profits off of them, they then circulate those profits back into the same company. You really want to, as a CEO in this position, be able to go back to these companies and say, hey, remember that time you gave us 10 million and we turned it into 30? Now I want you to give us 100 million so we can turn it into 300 million. And this is an important thing to keep in mind throughout the gaming industry that a lot of people seem to get mixed up. CEOs, executives, etc. in the gaming industry, these are not people whose job is to sell games to gamers. These are people whose job is to sell investments to investors. So, what do investors like? What are they looking for when you talk to them about this stuff? And the real short answer to that is investors like it when the line goes up. But to be slightly more specific, they like it when the line goes up by more each year. Investors aren't just looking for record profits. They're not just looking for the fact that you made more money this year than you did last year. What they're really looking for is how much more money did you make this year than last year? And was that more than the last time around? So just to use some real simple numbers, if your profits went up by 5% last year and they were happy with that, they'll probably be looking for 10% the next year. And then they'll be looking for 15 to 20% the year after that. Now, it's worth noting this is partially due to inflation, especially over the last several years. Like if you made 10 billion in one year and then another 10 billion the next year, you've technically made less money that next year because your 10 billion isn't worth as much. But even more importantly, they've got tons of people, investors have tons of people coming to them constantly with all sorts of different ways that they could be spending their money. And they're going to be looking for those sure bets. They're going to be looking for things that are like, yeah, I can be confident that if I put my money towards this company, I'm going to get even more back later on. So essentially, they want a line that looks like this. And that is where a lot of the problems that the gaming and tech industries are currently facing are coming from. For these industries, that line went up a lot in 2020 and 2021. I mean, think about it. Turns out for those couple of years, a lot of people were staying home. And when you're stuck indoors, you're going to be spending your money on things that let you get by on life while staying indoors. Things like watching more shows on Netflix, things like playing more video games, things like ordering your stuff on Amazon instead of going to the store. This was stuff that really drove a ton of profits for the gaming and tech industries in those couple of years. And while I want to be clear, COVID is still very much a thing and people are still getting very sick from it. It's something that we've, as a species, generally just gotten a lot better at dealing with. So there are fewer people stuck at home all the time, which means starting in 2022, that line wasn't going up by as much. Just looking at Amazon, for example, in 2020, their profits went up by 32% compared to 2019. And then again, in 2021, they went up by 29%. Now, that's a slight drop in 2021, but it's still a pretty straight line overall. It's not enough for investors to really start panicking or anything, especially compared to how big of an increase that was over previous years. But then in 2022, it only went up by 14%. So instead of the line looking like this, it actually looked more like this. Now that's still record profits. Like Amazon still made more total money in 2022 than they did in 2021. But that's a pretty big slowdown on the rate of increase, which is the sort of thing that makes a lot of investors, especially those who only really jumped on because the line was going so crazy in the first place, start to look elsewhere. It's kind of like if you've ever been like stuck in traffic, for example, and the lane you're in is moving pretty slowly, but the one next to you is going pretty quick. So you merge over and you get into that faster lane. And that lane's going pretty good for a while, but eventually it starts to slow down too. Even though you're still going faster than the other lanes next to you, you're gonna start watching to see if they're picking up speed so that you can know to merge over again if you're gonna get a faster path in another lane. Or maybe that's just me. Maybe I'm the asshole that goes back and forth all the time. I live in Southern California. That's just how we do things here. But wait, there's more. On top of that slowdown from lockdowns lifting and all of that, there was also the, and I'm going to piss off a lot of tech bros when I say this, complete and utter failure of Web3. There were a lot of tech and gaming investors who got super burnt on things like crypto, like NFTs, like play to earn games and all of that. These were concepts and ideas that were promising tons and tons and tons of profits, and many of them never came. In fact, a lot of those projects turned out to be built intentionally to scam investors out of money. So investors are now in a situation where they kind of don't care if the blockchain will ever become a thing, if play to earn ever takes off. That ship has sailed for them. They are over it and they're no longer interested in getting burnt again. So coming into 2023, investors are scared. They're worried and they are not feeling very confident in the tech and gaming markets, which means CEOs get desperate. Keep in mind, these CEOs, etc., their job isn't to sell games to gamers. Like I said, their job is to sell investments, essentially sell their company to investors. So they need those profits to continue to go up. And if they can't count on increased sales to sell those profits, they have to turn to their other option, which is cutting costs. And that means layoffs. So over the course of 2023, a ton of people lost their jobs, all in the name of making that line go up again. And probably the worst part of all this is that it didn't even work. Like, Amazon is still only up by 19% in 2023 from that 14% in 2022. And inflation, like I was mentioning earlier, probably covers most, if not all of that. But it wasn't even just the major corporations that got hit by all of these investors being scared to reinvest in the industry. There's a lot of smaller companies that just need investors to even operate in the first place. And as all that funding started to dry up, many of these companies genuinely just could not afford to pay their employees anymore. I know, that's what happened to me. And this unfortunately creates kind of a vicious cycle where as the layoffs continue to happen, well, that scares the investors even more because now they're less certain that this company's even going to be there in 6 months, let alone be able to produce this product they're saying is going to create a lot of money, which in turn means they're less likely to give out funding in the first place, which then also means that those companies then can't afford to pay their people and so on and so forth. It just gets worse and worse. Which brings us to today, January of 2024. Where are we now and what happens next? Now, even though I've spent over a decade working in this industry, I wouldn't really call myself an industry analyst. There's probably people that will make much more educated opinions and much more educated assumptions on where things are going next. But here's kind of what I'm guessing is going to happen. First off, in fact, partially based off of what some of these industry analysts have been saying, I kind of expect the industry is going to stay kind of a mess for a while. AAA in particular could get really weird over the next couple of years. I think we're going to see fewer and fewer risky projects from AAA companies and more just doubling down on those sure bets because those are what the investors are looking for, those sure bets that they know is going to make money. So prepare yourself for a lot of Call of Duty, I guess is what I'm saying. But I do think the industry will eventually stabilize, will eventually reach some sort of like standard point. And in fact, I'm hopeful and optimistic that we'll come out the other side of this in an even better state. AAA being kind of a mess right now just means there's opportunities for new teams, for smaller teams, for solo developers to create products that can really shine because they're not being crowded out by all the huge projects. Like, regardless of what's happening in the gaming industry, gamers are still going to want games. We're still going to want to have new things to play and new things to do. And that's a great opportunity for developers like the single developer behind Lethal Company. This is a game that is now one of the top selling games on Steam, made by just one single person who used to make Roblox games. Now, obviously, that is a massive amount of work that this one developer put into that game, but that's the sort of thing that I think is more possible right now than it has been in previous years, where AAA kind of took everything over. The other question to ask beyond just where do we go from here is, how do we fix this problem with the industry? Can we even fix this problem? And the reality is, at least at the core, like to just really resolve this problem once and for all, I don't really think we can. First off, a lot of what happened from this was the result of a pandemic that nobody could have predicted anyway. And that's a bit of a fluke situation. Let's hope we don't have to deal with more of that in the coming years. But also at the same time, like if we wanted to make it to where stuff like this could not occur, we basically have to replace the entire global economy with something else. I'm not just talking about the US. I'm talking about the way that money moves and assets move and people buy and sell things across the world would need to change. And saying the way to fix this problem is just change the global economy is about like saying, yeah, the best cure for the common cold is to just not be a human being. But much like the common cold, we can at least treat the symptoms. Even if we can't cure the thing outright, we can at least make things better when the industry suffers like this. And here's where I'm going to get a little preachy for a second. I apologize, but the majority of these companies are based in the United States, where our labor laws are pretty far behind a lot of other places. For example, many companies, if you're going to conduct layoffs, they will require you to notify those employees some sort of period in advance. And sometimes that can even be months. Now, the layoffs still occur and you're still going to lose your job, But at the very least, you have some time to figure out what you're doing next first, instead of just, come Monday morning, hey, by the way, you're unemployed. There are also a lot of countries that have severance requirements, so that when you do conduct a bunch of layoffs, you need to pay out some amount of money to those employees that you're cutting off. Wouldn't necessarily help anything in the cases where a company just straight up goes bankrupt, but in the case of a massive corporation laying people off as a cost-saving method, it would at least put a little bit of that money into the pockets of the people who now find themselves unemployed. We could even explore more stringent requirements to actually conduct the layoffs in the first place. I know that's something that a lot of countries have. I haven't looked too much specifically into what that is, but I know, for example, France is a country where if you want to conduct layoffs, you have to work with the French government and with like several labor boards and even your own employees for months just to prove that you need to do the layoffs in the first place. And I know as soon as I say all this, someone's going to say, but if we do all that, those companies will just go elsewhere. I know. I'm not saying that the US can or even should immediately become France in terms of labor laws. Like that would probably cause way more damage than it actually solved. But there's probably a middle ground in there somewhere. There's probably some smaller things that could be done that will improve people's lives and also make companies still not want to leave the country. And also at the same time, like, I don't know how much elsewhere there really is for them to go at this point. So many other countries have these laws in place that they would be moving from the United States to probably a place with even more stringent labor laws anyway. Basically, though, the point of this whole last section here is just to say that there really isn't a single fix for how to solve this problem. There really isn't a way to be like, how do we make sure this never happens again in the future? Because it can and probably will at some point. But what we can do is just try to make it less of a absolute nightmare for people if and when it happens again. Anyway, that's going to wrap this video up for today. Thank you so much for watching. I do have a couple of questions and responses to previous videos that I want to get into. The first one here comes from Laura Shala 79. Hope I said that right. Who said, my question as an avid fan for years, is there any chance you're going back to raiding like the months behind days? I've always wanted to raid with you. Is there any chance? This was in response to the video I put out a couple days ago announcing my Patreon and that I'm going back full time into content creation. And so my sort of two answers to this. One, if you're playing Season of Discovery, anyone can join our community guild. And I personally run anywhere from 3 to 5 raids a week, essentially, depending on the number of people that we have around to do Black Fathom Deeps. So if you are interested in that, we're playing Alliance on the realm Wild Growth. The guild is called Sounds Good. If you join my Discord, there's information on how to join that guild inside there. That's probably the easiest way to get that information across. So just pop into Discord, take a look at that guild channel, and you'll get all the info you need if you'd like to join up with us in Season of Discovery. But as for what I suspect is probably the core of this question, when they said rating like the months behind days, I don't know yet, honestly. I'm kind of waiting to see how heavily I get into The War Within when that comes out. It's very possible, especially now that I have the time again, it's very possible that I get fully back into hardcore raiding and I want to start pushing mythic raids and all of that. We'll just literally have to see how well things go with The War Within and how things take there. I'm not really planning to get into raiding for Dragonflight, but that's going to be... I'm actually going to talk a little bit more about how I'm approaching Dragonflight in a future video. That one might be next week, so keep an eye out for that. But as far as hardcore raiding goes, kind of a TBD. We'll see what happens with The War Within. I also wanted to follow up on a whole bunch of comments that were made from my last video where I was talking about artificial intelligence. I don't have specific like names or questions to put up on the screen here. There were a lot of comments that were along several different lines, both in response on the video and elsewhere. A big one, and one that I in hindsight, I should have brought up in the video as well, is how the AI actually sources its material is important. I completely agree. Where it gets that information from and how it trains itself, how that model is trained, is very important. And there are aspects of the ways that can be done that I don't like. That would be things like if you had an AI specifically train itself to sound like Matt Mercer, so that you could then have a Matt Mercer AI that sounds exactly like Matt Mercer and says things that Matt Mercer has not been paid to say, so that you can avoid paying Matt Mercer for his voice in that process. That to me is a clear, like, yes, absolutely, never that. And in fact, I'd even be in support of some sort of method for creatives, artists, voice actors, etc., to say, just don't use my work to train an AI. The stuff that I'm putting out, that should never be used to train an AI. I would be heavily in support of something like that. But I do think it's important to consider in all of this, and I don't have a direct answer for this part of this, but just something to keep in mind is that inspiration and derivative works are still a thing. Like that's still part of how people create. So we have to be careful that whatever gets set up to protect actors and protect creatives against their work being abused for the purposes of an AI as essentially a cost-saving maneuver, we have to figure out how to do that in a way that then doesn't make it so that you can't ever say, yeah, I played Team Fortress, so we made Overwatch. The other thing I want to comment on from that video is a lot of comments were along the lines of like, I don't like AI. I never want AI to be a thing. I don't think anybody should be using it at all ever. And while it would be certainly nice to put that Pandora back in the box, I don't think that's realistic. I don't think there's any future in which AI is not a thing. Like it's there now. It exists. We're better off figuring out what the challenges are and figuring out what the limitations and negative effects are going to be from it now so that we can figure out how to mitigate those and solve those problems than just sort of sticking our fingers in our ears and saying, well, it shouldn't be a thing in the first place, and then getting blindsided by how bad it can be if we don't participate in the discussions and make sure that it's handled responsibly. And also, like, there's a ton of things that people use every day that qualify as AI. Like it just gets really muddy trying to say just don't use AI. Like, what are we going to say that you have to remove the magic wand tool from Photoshop because it's technically using a form of AI to determine where the edges of something are? No, that gets a bit crazy. So I just don't think that's really a realistic angle to take. Anyway, that's it for me from today. Reminder, however, I will say once again, I did just start a Patreon. I'm going full time back into content creation. I've got a lot more stuff coming to YouTube. Check out my previous video. I'll link it in the description below, but also please check out my Patreon if you would like to throw some extra support my way so that I can make all of this happen. It's kind of a crazy, scary thing being like, yeah, you know what? Gainful employment? Nah, full-time content creation again. After going through everything in this video, I hope you understand why that's less scary of a choice than maybe it could have been. But it is still a scary thing. So any support that I can receive does really, really help a lot. And I really appreciate it. So please do check out my Patreon. I just posted, yesterday, by the time you're seeing this video, submissions for the first episode of Transmog Throwdown. So be sure to check that out as well. And as usual, any likes, any comments, if you want to subscribe here on the channel, that's great. Please do continue leaving me those questions and leaving me suggestions for topics you'd like to see me cover in the future, because that really, really helps. Especially when we have these sort of like semi-dry periods where I need to find other topics to talk about. It's good for me to have sort of a backlog I can go to and be like, yeah, remember when someone said that would be a good thing to talk about? Let me go back and talk about that. So thanks again, everybody. I'm going to wrap it up here. It's been great. I'll see you next week.